Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Helen Harrison, director of the Pollock-Krasner House and Study Center, and I want to welcome you to the penultimate talk in our series, The Art of Relationships, in conjunction with our current exhibition, Creative Exchanges, Artists in Jackson Pollock and Lee Krasner's Address Books. I'm grateful to the show's co-curators, James Bauer and Teresa Davis, both of whom are with us this afternoon, for doing such a splendid job of organizing the show, which includes work by some 30 artists who were especially close to Jackson and Lee. I hope you've all been able to see it, but if not, you can log on to the show's website, creativeexchanges.org, and get a taste of what they put together so beautifully. I also want to thank Victoria Pilato, Stony Brook University's digital librarian, for co-hosting this series, and Dorothy Lichtenstein, whose generous gift supports it. So today it's my turn to hold forth on some of the artists represented in the show, as well as others who formed the art community around Jackson and Lee in Springs. Not all of them are listed in the address book, so this talk will deviate somewhat from the show's theme and widen the scope a bit to include others who came along later, making the Springs the current epicenter of East Hampton's fabled and longstanding art community. So let me share my screen. And okay, can everyone see that? Good. Now, why is it called Bonac, Bohemia? Well, first of all, take a look at this little section right here. This map dates from 1960, and this shows the whole area around Cabonic Harbor, which you see here. And who is here with an easel standing out in the open air doing a painting, but an artist. So even by 1960, Springs was acknowledged as the real center of the art community, as it had developed in East Hampton since the 1870s and 80s. So I maintain that this is probably, East Hampton in general, the town, is probably the oldest continuously functioning art colony in the United States. And now Springs is art central. But for those of you who are, oops, let me get this right, who are not familiar with the territory, this is beautiful downtown Springs. And right here is the old schoolhouse, now Ashawa Hall, where many art exhibitions are held. This is the Springs Presbyterian Church. Over here is the Parker Anderson House, which was occupied by Elizabeth Parker, one of the artists I'll be mentioning, and is now the Springs Library. And over here is the blacksmith shop that originally stood across, across the street from the Pollock-Krasner house at 811 Springs Fireplace Road. And why is it called Bonac? Because this is Cabonic Creek, this little body of water that runs out into Gardiner's Bay. It is actually named, the name comes from a Native American word. The Bonac part of it is the place where ground nuts grow. So for the Montauk people who farmed and fished and settled in this area, this was a place where you could find indigenous food. And that name stuck, and Cabonic Creek is named, it's a Montaukett word that means the place where you find ground nuts. The first person to quote unquote colonize this area was actually not an artist, but an art critic, Harold Rosenberg. His house on Neck Path, which is no longer there, was purchased. He and his wife purchased it in 1944. So when Jackson and Lee first came to the area, they visited Harold and May Rosenberg, his wife, and I think that was one of the attractions for them actually to start looking for property there, because they did know someone, although Harold and May were not there year round. They were just summer people. But that little cottage was theirs as of 1944. In 1945, a number of artists from the city, the Surrealist group, came out and were basically hanging around in Amagansett. They were more or less camping out because everyone wanted to leave the hot city in the summertime. And they had a couple of collectors who lived in the area. So that was part of the attraction. And Robert Motherwell, who was, I guess, kind of their liaison with the American art community, because he spoke French and most of them didn't speak English. But there you see Motherwell playing chess with Max Ernst, who was here for the summer with his then, I guess they were married by that time, Dorothea Tanning. No, maybe not. They were perhaps just getting ready to get married because he was still married to Peggy Guggenheim. There you see him with Dorothea. This is she. And Maria Motherwell, who was Bob's wife, and Lucia Cristofonetti. She's the one with the garland, and she was one of the first artists to settle permanently in the area in 1946. Stanley William Hayter, whom you see here with his wife Helen Phillips, had come out for the summer in 1945 and rented the center cottage here, the central one of the three, on Louse Point. It's now $1 million summer home, but back then it was just a fisherman's shack. It had no plumbing, the roof leaked, and it was very primitive. In fact, it was so primitive that Hayter, who ran a workshop for printmakers in New York City, really couldn't put up with it. He had to be, first of all, closer to the train station because he was going back and forth into the city. And the place was just too primitive. So he and his wife moved into the village, but they had rented the cottage for the summer. And he mentioned it to his assistant, Reuben Kadish, and said, well, Reuben, do you think you and your wife would like to use it? It's there, you might as well. And Reuben said, sure. So he and his wife, Barbara, and their two boys came out for the summer, and Reuben was a very close friend of Jackson and Lee. And he said to Jackson and Lee, would you like to share it with us? Now, normally, Jackson and Lee would have gone up to the Cape because Hans Hofmann had his summer school there, and that was where the avant-garde went. Only the old fuddy-duddy landscape painters came out to the Hamptons at that point. So this was free, it was on offer, and Jackson and Lee said yes. And they spent, I guess it was August of 1945, with the Kadishes on Louse Point. Lee looked around the neighborhood and she thought it would be a good idea to get a winter rental. You have to wonder what she was thinking, but it was actually strategic. She wanted to get Jackson out of the city. She thought that if she could isolate him, he would become more productive, because this is right at the beginning of his career. Peggy Guggenheim was supporting him, and he needed to get the work done so that Peggy could promote him and sell the work. So Lee said, well, I think we should move out there for the winter. Jackson said no, but he changed his mind when he got back to the city. And he said to Lee, I think we should move there permanently, buy a house and settle down. And this is the house they bought, now the Pollock-Krasner house. But interestingly, they moved out with no guarantee that Peggy would help them buy it because they didn't have any money. But as you can see from this letter, they moved into the house on November 5th, 1945. And by November 10th, he's writing to his friend Reuben Kadish, things couldn't have turned out better. Peggy and Bill were here over the weekend, and she liked the place and got the spirit of the idea. So the idea was that by moving out of the city and out from under the pressure that he was being put under, he would be able to churn out the work and essentially justify Peggy's support. So they moved everything out for $150. She said that she would give them the down payment, or lend them the down payment, I should say. The East Hampton Bank, as you can see, came through with the mortgage. So in the spring, the contract was written and they actually purchased the property for a total of $5,000. But of course, they had to pay Peggy back. But it meant that they had to be productive. And here they are in early 1946. By this time, they had acquired a pet dog, Chip, And as you can see, Lee is very sunburned. I think they spent the first summer just cleaning the place out, but they did not neglect their work. And it's interesting to me that somehow moving to the country didn't stifle their creativity at all. In spite of all the work that they had to do to get the place in shape, they were able to paint significant amount of work. These are early works by both of them. Lee began her Little Image series. She said that she felt she had to lose cubism. And I think getting away from the city enabled her to essentially clear her head artistically. She started making these wonderful all over compositions with these very beautiful veils of color. Some of them are very thickly painted, almost like mosaics. And this series, what she later called her Little Image series, occupied her for about 5 years. But she began it right away, soon after moving in. This is Croaking Movement from Jackson's second series. His first series was called Sounds in the Grass. And you can tell that there was a kind of, I'm sorry, I misspoke. His first series was the Cabonic Creek series. And even though they're not landscape paintings, they were definitely inspired by the environment. And Croaking Movement as part of this Sounds in the Grass series, which is even more directly related to the natural phenomena that he was experiencing in the surroundings, even though they're obviously not literal. And they still contain some of the pictographic forms that he was working with in the earlier 40s. But now both of them are doing all over compositions and really transitioning into a much more subjective and expressive mode of working. Here they are with the house in the background as it looked back in 1949 before it was shingled. And you could see a couple of interesting features that no longer exist. One is the front door. Look right here, and you'll see there is a front door. After his successful show that winter, when they had the plumbing put in, the front door was removed and a small toilet room was put into the front entrance. And here is a chimney for a fireplace that was in the front parlor that was taken out later. So they made a lot of changes to the property. They improved the house and made it much more adaptable for exhibiting their artwork. And also, of course, they converted the barn to become Jackson's studio. And here he is working in the barn in 1947 when they were visited by their friends Herbert and Mercedes Matter. Mercedes and Herbert eventually built a house of their own on Fireplace Road in the early 1980s. Unfortunately, Herbert didn't really get a chance to enjoy it because he died in 1984, just a few weeks before Lee died. But they were constant visitors, and frequently Herbert would photograph Jackson in the studio. He's among the first photographers to take pictures of Jackson at work. And here you see him working on alchemy on this framework, which is his mother's quilting frame, which he borrowed from her apparently for that purpose, and in fact never returned. We still have this crossbar of the frame, and it's on display in the studio. And you see several of his early poured paintings in the background, including Galaxy up here. This is a small untitled one, a very beautiful one. And it's just a really nice image of him combining the liquid paints, which you see some of them over here, with the artist's oil colors. You see some spent tubes there on the floor. Now, as soon as they moved out, they started inviting their friends to visit. So they did not want to be cut off from the city, and they were not. Their friends came and looked around and thought, well, maybe they'd come out and get a place too. Jim Brooks and Charlotte Park actually took over Jackson and Lee's apartment when they moved out to Springs. And Jim and Charlotte came to visit, and they decided to buy a place in Montauk. So they were some distance away. They were maybe 15 miles, but they were frequent visitors, and Jackson and Lee were frequent visitors to them. And here you see Jackson on a visit with Jim and Charlotte in 1950. Unfortunately, in 1954, their studio was destroyed by a hurricane, Hurricane Carol, which really did a lot of devastation on the East End. And this was originally a fisherman's storage barn. Jim and Charlotte both had studios in it, and it was, as you can see, completely trashed. So the cottage in which they lived, that survived, and they had it moved to Springs. It's on Neck Path, and in 1957, it was installed over there. Jim built a purpose-built studio, and that's where they continued to live and work until their deaths. And here's a couple of examples of the kind of work they were doing at the time. Both very energetic action painters. And as you can see, there's a kind of lyrical quality to their work, perhaps inspired to some degree by the waves, the wind, the things that they experienced in their environment, although definitely not literal any more than Jackson and Lee's work was literal. But again, the country living and the isolation and the ability to concentrate and really develop their art, I think was very important, not only to them, but to many of the artists of that generation. Bill and Elaine DeKooning, they came to stay with Jackson and Lee in 1948 and came back and forth for a while. The photograph of them in 1953 was taken at Leo Castelli's house in Georgia, where they were staying for the summer. And around that time, Elaine's brother, Peter Freed, bought a house on Cabonic Road in Springs. And in 1956 or so, they moved in there, not permanently, it was just a summer place, but that was their first house in Springs. And in 1957, they separated. Elaine went off to the Southwest. Bill continued to live in the house. And in the early 1960s, he bought property off Fireplace Road and began building his dream house and studio, which I'll show you a picture of later. But this was their first place. It still belongs to the DeKooning family and is directly opposite Green River Cemetery. A couple of examples of the work they were doing at the time. Elaine was doing a series of what she called Faceless Men. So you identify them by their posture, by their body stance, by the way they carried themselves. And it has a kind of ethereal quality, but you can definitely tell that it's Bill. Bill was doing things that were more abstract, and Easter Monday is one of the examples from that period. And in 1948, again, that crucial year, Mark Rothko rented the cottage that Jackson and Lee had stayed in a few years previously on Louse Point. He had already started this series of multiforms where he's transitioning from the surrealist-inspired imagery of the mid-1940s to what we think of as the classic Rothko with the bands of floating color, but they later became more simplified. He worked on a whole series of them at Louse Point, and at the end of the summer, when Harold Rosenberg went to visit, he said Rothko pulled out about 50 paintings, and he had just been so astonishingly productive. And he said one after another was just magnificent, and it was the most exciting and stimulating studio visit that Rosenberg had ever had. It is very tempting to draw analogies between the Louse Point landscape and these floating clouds of color that you see in the Rothkos. But Rothko disavowed that. He said that his work was not inspired by the landscape, although I can't help but feel that somehow it did infuse him somewhat. But he said that the paintings were not paintings of experience. The paintings were the experience. So he was not happy with the idea that there was a landscape analogy. But again, when you see these things in conjunction with the landscape, you can't help but feel that there was some kind of stimulus going on. And it was an extremely productive stay at Louse Point. He later came back, I think in the early 60s it was, and rented near Devon in Amagansett. Oh, there we go. Another 1948 visitor was John Little, and he was an old friend of Lee's from the Hoffman School. Many of the artists in the address books and in our exhibition knew Jackson and Lee, or either knew Lee through the Hoffman School or knew Jackson and Lee from the WPA. So they went back several years, a decade or more. And for many of them, the idea of being out here near Jackson and Lee and other colleagues was very appealing. In fact, I think it was Patsy Southgate who said that one of the reasons that artists gathered together in art colonies was so they could love and hate one another more conveniently. I love that quote. But John was directed to a rundown farm over on 3 Mile Harbor Road, which ultimately became what was called Duck Creek Farm, and has now become the art center at Duck Creek. He had a barn moved onto it. There was no barn on the property, oddly, but he had the old Gardner barn moved up from East Hampton and put on the property to become his studio. And there you see Jackson in it around 1954, after he had grown that unfortunate beard. And here's John in the studio. I love that shirt he's got with the little dogs on it. It's so cute. And his daughter, Abigail. John was originally a textile designer and had quite a successful business in New York, but decided to go back to art school, studied with Hoffman. That's where he met Lee, and they remained lifelong friends. And here you see one of his 1955 paintings where he was a master colorist, and he would build these compositions of just areas of color interacting with one another in very evocative ways. But so most of the work for which he is best known is this type of, as he called it, color architecture. A couple of transients of note who came repeatedly but did not ever have studios here. Oh, let me admit someone. Franz Klein, inside the barn, at John Little's place, there was a second story, like a loft area, which you got up to with ladder-like steps, and it was a little living area. And Klein apparently spent a lot of time there, and so although he didn't have a studio of his own, I guess he would work in Little's studio while he was in residence. Noguchi would come out to visit. In fact, he came to the opening of the Pollock-Krasner house, where I met him, and I said, did you work out here? And he said, my dear, I came here to play, not to work. So that was his enjoyment, was visiting, but he did actually do some work. You see this photograph of, this is the little barn that was moved over to the Pollock and Krasner property in 1953. It was on a farm somewhere here in Springs. They moved it over, and it was designed to become Lee's studio. The patio, this little area here, it no longer exists. The whole building has been completely renovated, but this patio was laid by Jackson and Isamu. Noguchi brought some slate out from the city, and you can see some little pieces of marble here and some odds and ends of stone work that he evidently brought, and they put down and created the patio. So he was actually coming, it was a bit old home week for him, coming to the opening of the museum. Oops. There we go. Elizabeth Parker, whom I mentioned earlier, Elizabeth Parker Anderson, who left her house to become the Springs Library. She and John Little and Alfonso Osorio, who was not a Springs local, he lived in Wainscott. But in 1957, they opened a gallery in East Hampton because they felt that there wasn't enough of an outlet for new, more advanced work. So they had this gallery called the Cigna Gallery, originally on Main Street. And then in 1960, it moved over to what is now the parking lot of Stop and Shop. There was an automobile dealership there, and you can see the window of the dealership in the background of the color shot. And they showed not only their own work, but work by European modernists, Asian modernists, and their colleagues from the New York School. And it was quite successful in the sense that it exposed a lot of work that people would not have seen otherwise. Financially, it was not successful. I think Alfonso told me they just about broke even, but it was a lot of work. As Jim and Teresa will tell you, putting together group shows is no easy task. And this was the kind of thing that the New York dealers who were closed in the summer, they would send their inventory out to East Hampton and let the Cigna show it. They also did lectures and had, different activities that went along with the gallery. And it was after the fourth year, I think it was Elizabeth, no, it must have been John, who told me that they just didn't have enough time to do their own work. They were spending all their time driving back and forth to the city and visiting studios and visiting galleries, and they weren't in their own studios. So they gave it up after 1960. But it had a fabled existence, and it is still fondly remembered today as a venue for many of the artists who were just beginning to gain recognition and notoriety in the 1950s. So others who came in the 50s, Conrad and Anita Marcarelli, they occupied the house immediately to the north of the Pollock-Krasner house, which is known as Squirrel Hall. Conrad, I'll show you an example of his work. He and Jackson became close friends for the few years that they were neighbors. And Jackson visited his studio one time, and there was a mannequin hanging on the wall. And Jackson said, "What's that?" And Conrad said, "Well, from my work, I need to start with something. I need a figure or some kind of form that I can start with. It doesn't just come out of my head." And Jackson criticized him for that. He said, no, you should be more imaginative. You should not have to depend on that. But that was one of the things they had to agree to disagree about. Nicholas and Adele Caron, they had a place over on 3 Mile Harbor Road, and there you see it. And here are a couple of examples of the work by both of them. Now, I think that it's not all that evident that Marcarelli started with a figure, but when he titles it Warrior, you can tell it looks like maybe a figure in armor. Caron was more free form, if you like, and his work, he was a little bit younger, so his work transitioned into the 1960s. Wilfred Zogbaum was a very important conduit, because although he started out as I believe he and Lee met at the Hoffman School, and he became a war photographer during World War II, and then had a very successful commercial photography business in New York City. But when he bought his property in the late 50s on Fireplace Road, he sold pieces of it to other artists. He had a fairly large patch of land, and among the artists he sold to were Willem DeKooning and John Farren. And the Farren house, of course, is still there today. And DeKooning started building his house in 1962 on property that he bought from Wilfred Zogbaum. Zog used to go out onto the beach and collect these rocks, which his friends called Zog stones, and incorporate them into his welded metal sculptures. Here they are on the Zogbaum property. You see one of the early softball games. It did not start, as the publicity would have you believe, in 1948, because Zogbaum wasn't there in 1948. He wasn't there until I think about 1955 or 54. But the scene on the left shows Bill DeKooning at bat. He was supposedly a lousy hitter, and Howard Kanowitz is the catcher. And you see John Farren at the lower left. He purchased the property adjacent, and his son Bran Farren still has a house there. So here's the DeKooning property, which adjoins the Zogbaum and Farron properties. This is on Woodbine Drive, and Bill started building it in the 1962 or so, and I don't think he finished it for 4 or 5 years, but it incorporates both living and working environment, and unfortunately not open to the public, but we're hoping that at some point his family will decide to make it available. Some of the other Springs denizens who came kind of in the wake of Jackson and Lee: Ibram Lassaw, whose property was off Fireplace Road. And I think you can see, not really that apparent, but it's an industrial building, or it was an industrial building. It has since been demolished, and the property is now occupied by Ross Bleckner. Pearl Fine was on Red Dirt Road, and her studio still exists, although it's no longer in the family. Joan Mitchell came in the 1950s, and there's a painting that she did called, it's not actually in this photograph, but it's similar, that she did of her dog, George, at Barnes Landing. The dog is not visible in the painting, but she said it was, they had to leave because it got too cold for the dog to go swimming. So it was clearly a landscape-inspired image, but as she said, she carried her landscape around with her. She did not paint pictures of the land, but it wasn't only abstractionists up here. Now, here we do have a couple of abstractionists, Mike Goldberg and Herman Sherry, who were renters and who came out regularly. The Fisherman's Fair, you can see what they're doing here. They're raffling off these works that are tacked up to the stanchions. They were raising funds for, I guess, the Springs Improvement Society. And this was early days of getting the artists involved in civic affairs. And of course, the artists have become very much involved in all sorts of local improvement projects and are really very involved in the community, because many of them are now full-time residents. Not all, but quite a lot. And in fact, the woman who organizes the annual Artists and Artifacts show at Ashawa Hall told me that there are some 80 artists who are Springs residents now. So that is really quite a huge compliment. The architect Frederick Keisler also had a place on Old Stone Highway. And this is very late in his career. He's best known for creating the so-called Endless House, which was never built. It was a concept, very organic, almost looks like mushrooms sprouting out of the earth. I guess his best known completed architectural creation is the Shrine of the Book in Israel. But this is a sculpture called Bucephalus. Bucephalus, of course, was Alexander the Great's horse. And he evidently was trying to create, almost looks like it would have been a Trojan horse because he's inside it. But I don't think it was ever completed. Here we also have some artist couples. Most of them are, well, a couple of them are still with us, Mary Anzac and Bill Kuriazis. They're where you see them at the box art auction. This is another contribution that artists make. They very often will submit their work for sale for some charitable purpose, and that's what they're doing here. Margie Kerr and Robert Richenberg are no longer with us. Saul Steinberg and Hedda Stern, they separated, and each of them had their own house in Springs. Saul Steinberg was directly opposite Tino Nivola, and Hedda Stern was up on Hog Creek. But both of them had their separate residences. Sheridan Lord and Francine Downs, they came out in the 1950s. And what you see here is them helping Lee Krasner to inventory and document Pollock's work after his death. That is his painting on glass, number 28, 1950. And they're just holding it up to be photographed. And as I said, not everybody was an abstractionist. Here's work by both of them, clearly inspired by and picturing the Cabonic Creek environment. Ross Bleckner, I mentioned, who bought the old Lasaw property and built his own studio there. Laurie Anderson is also a native. I mean, a local, excuse me. No, you have to live in Bonac for about 3 generations before you're considered a native. And Cindy Sherman lives up the road, and she recently purchased Squirrel Hall, which had been Marcarelli's studio, and then became C.Y. Wilder's house. And then now it belongs to Cindy Sherman. So they are only 3 among the scores of artists who are living and working locally. And then, of course, we have the permanent residents. When Jackson died in 1956, the stone that you see in the foreground, right here, this was put on the gravesite to become his tombstone. It was originally located behind the house as part of a pile of these glacial erratics that Jackson had placed there in 1956. Lee decided that he liked those stones and that one of them would be an appropriate gravestone, so she had it moved onto the site at Green River Cemetery, but she was not satisfied with it. So the following spring, she had this much larger stone installed, and here is a picture of it. The man standing next to it with the cap, he is over 6 feet tall, so you can see how big the rock actually is. Half of it is underground. You see it's sort of semi-buried there. And there is Lee conferring with Bill DeKooning and Franz Klein about placing the stone. So this, of course, now these people, there are over 50 artists who are permanent residents of Springs, not all of whom lived in the area. Probably the most notable stranger, shall we say, is Ad Reinhardt, who, as far as we know, may have come for a cocktail party at one point, but really never had any residential or even a studio of any kind in the area. And he is buried there, as well as Stuart Davis, who was also not a local. He would go to Gloucester. And I asked a friend of his family why he was buried in Springs. And she told me that his wife felt that people wouldn't visit his grave if it were in Gloucester. And they weren't going to bury him in the family plot in Philadelphia because she didn't get along with the family. So they got a grave in Springs. And so there are a few people who are perhaps kind of surprising that they're there. But one of the most poignant for me is the grave of Jimmy Ernst, with this wonderful inscription: "Artists and poets are the raw nerve ends of humanity. By themselves, they can do little to save humanity. Without them, there would be little worth saving." So I leave you with that thought. And if anyone has any comments, please unmute yourself. I see, the group photo definitely taken by Herbert Matter. Thank you very much, Ellen. I think you must be right about that. So I'm happy to take more comments in the chat, or if you would like to unmute yourself, please feel free to do that.
I can tell you that photograph was found in the Herbert Matter material that was left to Stanford.
Oh, good. Okay.
Yeah. So it's
next time I visit, I'll be sure to caption it properly.
Definitely. Yeah. And I have a little comment, which is kind of interesting about Wilfred Zogbaum and being fixated on this rock business.
Mm-hmm.
In the summer, I think it was, of 1965, the Joan Mitchell and John Paul Riopel were, sort of sailing around in the Côte d'Azur or whatever it is, and I guess Wilfred's son Rufuss was with them.
Oh.
And Rufuss became fixated on a rock that he said he had to go see. Okay. And that led to a small series of paintings by Joan Mitchell called Rufuss's Rock.
Oh, how wonderful.
One of them is in the collection of Christian Levitt, which is why I know about it. And I think it's in the show that started at the Whitechapel and is traveling around Europe, and it will eventually be in a show of American women abstract expressionists. It's going to travel around the United States from 2024 to 2026.
Wonderful. Well, Rufuss has just given us a sculpture by Zogbaum that has.
Okay, well, maybe you should ask him about this rock thing.
I will.
Yeah, let me know.
The sculpture is called Pacia's Gift, and it was given to Harold and May Rosenberg's daughter, Pacia. And when she died, it was given back to the Zogbaum estate, and he has given it to us. So it really comes full circle.
Yeah. So there's a couple of paintings. There's at least two that are called Rufuss's Rock.
I will definitely ask him about it.
Yeah, ask him about it and then let me know, because maybe I can add it to my label or something.
Okay. Well, I'll give you his email address and you can ask him yourself.
No, you should ask him because you know him.
He was one of the people, he was working for New York Conservation Associates when the floor was uncovered, and I have photographs of him working on the floor.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Very cool.
So, anyone else have any comments? I apologize for having left out the 75 other artists who I could have mentioned, because writing a book about this, it was impossible it becomes a laundry list. You just can't cover everything. So I tried to keep it to people whose names you might recognize or who were especially important as part of the early community. But my apologies to those I left out. And I should acknowledge, by the way, before you speak, Arlene, I just want to acknowledge, since Phyllis Braff is here, she is the one who did the pioneering work on this in this show from Guildhall back in 1976. This was a centenary exhibition. And she did so much of the background work on who was here, when, and where, that I really have to say that, she, as Bill would have said, she broke the ice. And now, Arlene, you had a comment.
I just wanted to congratulate you. I thought this was such an outstanding talk, and the images were just wonderful. I live in Springs on DeKooning Street, and so I'm familiar with all the people that lived there, but you just presented it so well. I just wanted to thank you. And of course, we're all anxious to see the James Brooks opening at the parish on August 5th.
Right. Yes, it's wonderful that they're doing it. I know it's been postponed because of COVID, but it's very timely. And we have a beautiful Jim Brooks in the exhibition, in our little exhibition. And it's a little James Brooks, but full of the kind of very organic energy that he put into all of his work. Oh, anybody else? Okay, well, then I will recommend that you come back for our final talk in this series, which is next week on July 30th, when Henry Adams will be here remotely from Cleveland, talking to us about Thomas Hart Benton, Jackson Pollock, and El Greco. So thank you again all for coming. Good afternoon, good evening, and see you next week, I hope. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Helen. Bye-bye.